Good afternoon, everyone. My name is John Macca. I'm Director of Public Programs here at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. We're going to get started. We're delighted to feature Save the Elephants on our platform again. We hosted Ian Douglas Hamilton back in 2012, and we're pleased that Mr. Pope has joined us here today. We'd like to thank dedicated council member Lori Suter for bringing us this opportunity. A few logistics at the front end here. We are on the record and live streaming, so please silence your phones, otherwise it'll be permanently archived on our YouTube page. While you have your phones out and you're silencing them, we'll take questions later from microphones in the room, but also through our online app. Rotating over here is the web address that you can go and type in questions. It's chi.cnf.io. Literally just go and type that in your browser and the question page will pop up. We're nearing the end of our programming season, but we still have a few important and timely topics to cover, notably discussions on North Korea, America's role in the world, the deep state, and the increasing relevance of global cities in policy and the economy. As hopefully most of you know, the Council is a membership organization. If your interest is piqued by these programs, I hope you'll consider joining one of our membership levels, which begin at $100. If you're a member, thank you already for your support. It allows us to produce affordable, accessible, and independent content throughout the year. Turning back to today's program, a brief disclaimer. For nearly a century, the Council on Global Affairs has provided an independent, nonpartisan platform for a variety of different voices to promote deeper global understanding and active U.S. engagement in the world. Views expressed by individuals we host are their own and do not represent institutional positions or views of the Council. Following the presentation today, I will return to moderate Q&A. Now, a few words about Lori Suter, who will introduce our speaker. Lori is a Director Circle member of the Council. She has done extensive work on conservation and animal issues globally and in Chicago. She is a governing member ambassador of Brookfield Zoo and is also a conservation ambassador at Save the Elephants. Please join me in welcoming Lori Suter.
Good afternoon and welcome. It's so wonderful to see all of my friends and so many familiar faces in the crowd. So thank you so much for being here. It's wonderful to see all of you, so thank you. And also thank you to the Council for inviting me to introduce my friend Frank Pope. I first came to know of Save the Elephants 8 years ago while on safari in Kenya, where I was fortunate to meet the in-laws of Frank Pope, Ian and Oria Douglas Hamilton, the first people on the planet to study elephant behavior in the early 1970s. Their knowledge, energy, and devotion to the elephant world has fed my passion and solidified my commitment to become an advocate for this majestic species. I'm delighted today that we have an opportunity to hear from Frank. The last decade has seen a terrible surge in trade in ivory. At its peak, 100,000 elephants were killed in just 3 years between 2010 and 2012. The response was global outcry, followed by global action to end the killing and the ivory trade that was driving it. The world's most populous nation, China, has moved from being the primary threat to elephant survival to being a cause for hope. With a bigger ivory trade than anywhere else in the world, China's ivory market was driving rapid declines in elephant populations across Africa. Last year, the government announced it would completely shut down its ivory markets. Partly as a result of these changes, the wholesale price of raw ivory has decreased steadily, making the ivory trade less and less profitable. These developments offer a glimpse of hope for the survival of elephants, yet, as recent scientific studies have shown, elephants face challenges beyond the ivory trade. There is much to discuss, and I'm sure that Frank will enrich our conversation today with his deep experience from the field in Kenya and elsewhere in Africa. Before I hand over the microphone, I would like to say a few brief words about him. Frank Pope is CEO of Save the Elephants, which he joined in 2012 at the height of the poaching crisis. He previously focused on marine science and conservation before turning to journalism as the first ocean correspondent for the Times newspaper in London. He also reported for the BBC, hosting the TV series Britain's Secret Seas. As Save the Elephants, he leads a team dedicated to revealing the intricate and complex world of elephants and forging solutions for their protection. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming my friend, Frank Pope.
Thank you very much indeed. Can you hear me? Have I got a microphone? Yeah. Great. Well, thank you. Thank you all of you for coming to hear about elephants today. It's a great honor to speak here at the Chicago Global Council. I know a little bit about the Council's history and its mission to reach Americans in the wider world, and it was set up at a time when America was turning inward, and I think we all have felt through the years the power of American outreach and engagement in the world, and certainly that's the case with elephants, and I'm going to tell you a little bit today how. I don't have a screen, but I can see the screen there. My talk is Build Battling Africa's Elephant Crisis, but really this is a global crisis, and it's very global in nature, and it required a global solution. So before I dive into the current situation, I want to give you a little bit of context about where we are and how we got there. So Save the Elephants is, as Laurie was saying, we're a research organization that's also deeply involved in conservation, but all of our work is grounded in science. We've got a pretty broad reach across the continent of Africa and into Asia, but we are based in Kenya, and I hope that any of you who haven't been there will come and see us there if you ever get a chance. So Save the Elephants was founded in about 20 years ago by Ian Douglas Hamilton, who's here. Now, he actually spoke here a couple of years ago. Ian was the first to study African elephants in the wild. Back in 1965, he actually started. So he's pulled off 50 years working for elephants now. Ian was dispatched to study elephants at a time when Jane Goodall was making the first investigations into chimpanzees in the wild, when Dian Fossey was investigating the gorillas, and Ian, in fact, wanted to study lions, but was told that George Schaller had already taken lions, so he had to have elephants. So he went off to Manyara National Park in Tanzania and discovered a new way to tell elephants apart as individuals. So by looking at the outline of their ears and the shape of their tusks, you can build an identification database and start revealing the inner workings of elephant society. This was not something that had been done before at all. And through the course of that work, he revealed that elephant society wasn't led by the big, imposing bulls that everyone had thought there were. They're in fact led by, much like humans, led by the females in society. And it was this discovery of matriarchy that was one of the key discoveries. So he was studying elephants and raising his family in the bush. And in fact, this is a very significant player he has in his hands, which is his eldest daughter, Saba, who's actually responsible for yanking me from the world of the ocean and making me evolve, grow some legs, and start working with elephants. And I'm very grateful to her for that. Ian was working with elephants in Manyara. He continued his studies, and it was in the mid-70s that he started to realize something was amiss. Something was going wrong. He was seeing more and more incidences of elephants being killed for their ivory. The trade in ivory at that time was big in Japan, Europe, and America. There were a lot of a thriving trade for sort of billiard balls and piano keys, and it was widespread at the time. And it was accepted that this was okay, but Ian suspected that what was happening was not sustainable. So he took off around the world to count what was happening. All the other big conservation organizations were saying, it's fine, what are you talking about? Don't be alarmist. But he said, we don't have the data. We need the data. So he took off and flew across 33 countries in a little plane like this, building a network of all the scientists across the continent and people who knew of populations in the forests, and he counted them on the savannas. And he established that 1.3 million elephants still existed in Africa at that time, when he published his paper in 1976. The network he established became the foundation of what's now the African Elephant Specialist Group that still exists today, and which just published their most recent findings last year, which I'll tell you about. This data turned out to be the foundation of a global movement to end the ivory trade. Because in 10 years' time, they surveyed again and they found that only 600,000 elephants remained. So in just a decade, in the 70s and 80s, the actual number of elephants on the ground in Africa had halved. Now people were listening, and now people realized. And so Ian was very much at the center of this charge, and which culminated in this pyre of ivory in Nairobi in 1989. The Kenyan government decided to burn a stockpile of 12 tons. And it was a huge statement, a rallying cry for the world to say ivory should not be valued as a material. The elephant populations cannot sustain it. We must end valuing of ivory. So this pyre went up in smoke, and months later, the nations of the world gathered at the International Endangered Species Convention called CITES, and they decided to put in place an international ban on the trade. And that ban has stayed in force until today. We'll see what happened to go wrong recently. But this pyre was a huge statement and led to the ban. And in conjunction with PR campaigns in Europe and America and Japan, we saw the price of ivory collapse, trade collapsed. Trade in Japan went from 500 tons a year imports to 5 tons a year consumption. We saw the beginning of a long trend of 20 years of recovery in elephant populations. So with this trade ban in place, Ian decided, right, I can get back to my behavioral studies now, and he thought, where am I going to go? And he chose this place, this beautiful wilderness in the north of Kenya called Samburu. And in Samburu, we're blessed to have a people, the Samburu people, who've lived alongside elephants for millennia without hunting them. They're pastoralists, they live off their livestock, off blood and milk, and they have herded their cattle alongside elephants for millennia. So these elephants are very tame and trusting and make perfect research subjects and also very beguiling hosts if you ever come and visit. They're wonderful to spend time with, and they let you come close and into their world. So the mission of Save the Elephants is wide, but I just want to read our mission statement because I think it encompasses the range of challenges that we face with elephants. So the mission is to secure a future for elephants and sustain the beauty and ecological integrity of the places they live, to promote man's delight in their intelligence and the diversity of their world, and to develop a tolerant relationship between the two species. And I think that it's that combination of using science to explore their world, to communicate the wonder of what we find, the amazing intelligence that elephants display, and also to try and protect the landscapes in which they live. All of these are critical to securing a future for elephants. So this is David Dabalan, who's one of the key members of our team, and Ian trained up a core of researchers in the techniques he developed in Manyara to get them to be able to meet elephants as individuals and understand them as individuals. This guy was born in a traditional mud manyatta in Kenya, and now he's one of Africa's finest field biologists. He knows perhaps 500 elephants by sight alone. He says he recognizes elephants more easily than people. And you put him in the passenger seat of the plane, and you can fly past a group of elephants at 80 knots at 300 foot above the deck, and he'll be leaning out the window going, I know who that is. And he'll tell you who that is. It's an amazing skill, and we're very lucky to have him and a team of others like him. So in Samburu, where our research center is based, we conduct this fundamental research, but the idea is not just to be focused on that. The idea is to focus on understandings about elephants and their populations and their population dynamics and their society that we can then apply elsewhere across their range, and also to forge tools for their conservation that we can use. So, and alongside this individual research, we also started developing further this other technique that Ian had developed back in Manyara, which is the radio tracking of elephants. Now, elephants, as you know, they're the largest land animal living on this planet, and it's the last big one standing, and they live enormous lives. And you can't follow an elephant on foot. They're too fast. You can't follow them in a car because they go over, the terrain is too rough. You can't follow them in a plane because you haven't got fuel tanks big enough, and eventually you run out of fuel and they keep on walking. The only way that you can study the full extent of their lives is with these radio collars. And Ian put the first one of these on in the 70s, and back then they were VHF transmitters, and to get the signal you'd have to climb to the top of a hill and get your antenna out and listen for the bleep or fly around, and to get a fix 2 or 3 times a week would have been high-intensity monitoring. Well, fast forward to 1998, and we had GPS modules in these collars. So now we're getting fixes every hour. But you still had to you'd collect the data off the satellite network, and expensive, but you could do it. This technology has got better and better and better, and now we use cell phone technology in a lot of it, and we have a lot of the sensors that you find in an iPhone on board of these collars. And this technology has really helped reveal the intricacies of what drive elephants' decision-making, and helps us really understand how elephants use landscape and what they need to survive in a landscape. They had other uses as well that I'll come to in a minute. After about 20 years of the ban, in 2008, CITES, the Global Management Authority, made a sadly misguided decision. Under pressure from southern African range states in Africa, they decided to allow a one-off sale of ivory. Initially to Japan, and then China saw that Japan was going to buy this ivory and said, well, if you're going to sell to Japan, we want in as well. So CITES allowed this one-off sale of ivory to Japan and China. That sparked a demand that had been dormant until that time. This was given extra spin by the huge boom in the Chinese economy at the time. And suddenly ivory was on the menu again, and it became fashionable to give as a very ostentatious gift to, say, an official who'd done you a favor. You'd give an intricately carved piece of ivory that was explicitly very valuable. So we, as Laurie was saying, that by 2014, the price of ivory had reached over $2,100 a kilo. And this was inciting the interest of criminal syndicates around the world who already had trafficking routes set up. They were moving drugs and other illicit goods through their networks. And as a good businessman does, they say, well, we can make money there too. So these criminal syndicates began shipping ivory, which was they were having to pay about $100 a kilo in Kenya, and it was fetching north of $2,000 a kilo in China. That, of course, incites poaching. So many of the people, like David's brothers and sisters back in his village, they're offered that kind of money for a tusk. They become poachers. They become criminals as well. And this is what has then driven this scourge of poaching. And suddenly all these individuals that we'd grown to know and love and that we were understanding their lives began to disappear. And this is Philo, who was a young male that was part of our study population. And a week later, this is him. And this was repeated time and again. And I can't tell you how galling it is when you've learnt about an elephant as an individual, and then you find him in a state like this. The 32 mature bulls that we had in that study population was reduced to 5 by 2014. A fifth of the families had all of the adult females, the mature females, killed. So they were essentially orphan herds wandering the landscape without the benefit of the experience that elephant society needs to pull them through. So what could we do about it? You know, we needed then to sort of pull from being back from research and get back onto conservation. So it was very obvious to Ian early on that critical would be addressing the demand in China. We had to let the Chinese people know what the impacts of their buying of ivory was. It was also obvious that with a country the size of China, that was going to take some time, and we needed to get enforcement better on the ground and stop people from killing elephants, actually protect elephants on the ground. And we also had to try and disrupt these trafficking networks that were shipping the ivory from Africa to China. So we linked arms with the other organizations in our landscape, the Northern Rangelands Trust, the Kenya Wildlife Service, and a lot of other organizations besides. We knew that this was going to be too big for us to do on our own. So we formed a coalition, and we started working together. We started reaching out to the communities, as well as to China. We started reaching out to the communities and letting the elders from these communities and the women know what the warriors were doing. And these are people, as I said, have lived for thousands of years alongside elephants. And the elders and the women were shocked to hear. And our teams would lead the women out and say, look, here's a carcass. And they said, but how did we not know? This is only a mile away from our village. And they didn't know because the warriors were trying to hide it because they were ashamed. But by outing this problem in the community, it started to make a difference. So the other thing we realized we could do was to share the tracking data that had been helping us with our research and share it with the groups around us who were concentrating on enforcement, like the Northern Rangelands Trust. And we put this data in their command and control rooms. Is it going? Okay. So each different color is a different elephant. And this is sorry for the quality of this. This is a screen grab from this morning. But these are all the elephants in the north of Kenya. Each dot is an hourly fix. And this is a large area of about 20,000 square kilometers. And it's a big area to patrol with a small number of rangers. But if you have this information to guide your patrolling, you can do so much more effectively. And you can get ahead of the elephants, and you can effectively shepherd them. And you can patrol a much larger area with a much smaller number of rangers. And this is one of the key things that has transformed the situation in the north. So we have to figure out, are we succeeding? Are we making a difference? And the population surveys that Ian was doing back in the day are perhaps the most critical way. That's the absolute way you can tell what's going on. But we needed a faster way of looking at things. And the CITES management authorities set up a system with 50 monitoring sites across Africa. And we run the one in Samburu. And this is what it told us. So you've got, I'm just going to jump down here. You can see, this metric is called pike. So out of every 10 elephants that you find, dead elephants that you find, how many of them were killed for their ivory? That gives you the proportion. And that's a key indicator. And we know from our demographic studies that if more than 54% of elephants, dead elephants, have been killed for their ivory, that population is likely in decline. So up to 2008, it's below the critical level. 2008, it starts to get there. It's driven down very suddenly in 2009 because of a drought that killed a lot of elephants naturally. So it caused this overwhelming proportion of naturally killed elephants. Come 2010, you suddenly see the graph reach crisis proportions, and it gets up to 73%, which is awful. But then the interventions start to take hold, and it wasn't just what we were doing in the north. It was countrywide legal reform by partners of ours called Wildlife Direct, But as you can see, by 2014, we were having more babies born than elephants that were being killed. So this was a huge success. And we thought, okay, we've done it. But unfortunately, this success is not replicated everywhere. And we've got a very strong conservation sector in Kenya, whereas elsewhere in Africa, it's much, much more wild. And this is a photo from 2 days ago from Garamba National Park in northern Congo. It's really on the front line. It's run by a wonderful organization called African Parks. And these are 9 elephants that were killed in one go by a militia there. That park is beset by at least 5 different groups, rebel militias, from the Janjaweed from South Sudan to the remnants of the Lord's Resistance Army, which I'm sure you know about, to the ADF from Congo, and myriad others. And they are marauding bands of heavily armed nomads that don't recognize borders. They're very hard to enforce. And it's a growing security threat that I think is increasingly grabbing the attention of national defense forces. So these guys actually, the gunshots were heard by a ranger patrol. 2 of the elephants they found had their ivory removed. They helicoptered a team in there. They set an ambush around there. The poachers came back that night to try and take the rest of the ivory. They engaged in a firefight. They got one of the poachers, but the others got away. And there we are with another 9 elephants gone. The population there, despite huge investment, is still in decline. But with African Parks at the helm, they've now got 1/3 of their ranger force in repeated training, and with lots of resources to try and get them have the absolute best tools they can to defend these parks. And they're amazing men, these rangers on the ground who do so as much for their passion for the environment as they do for their paycheck at the end of the month. At Save the Elephants, what we wanted to do was try and spread the success that we'd had in Samburu elsewhere. So but what we didn't want to do was to create a beast of an organization that had its own fiefdom. We wanted to create the kind of collaboration that had worked so well in Samburu. And so we set up an Elephant Crisis Fund with our partners, the Wildlife Conservation Network. And the idea was that we would raise money and then give 100% of that money out to the organizations through our networks, which after Ian's 50 years across Africa are very extensive. And we would give 100% of this money to the best organizations on the ground, be they small, little, deeply embedded organizations, or the likes of WWF or the Wildlife Conservation Society, who have good projects and that we wanted to focus on elephants. 4 years on now, we've got over 140 different projects with more than about 40 partners in 30 countries. And it's been very effective. It's been effective on the ground anti-poaching. We've also been starting to have some success against these crime cartels. We are fighting the same battle with this fund and all of the organizations that are working with us and outside the fund, everyone who's working on this problem. We're fighting drug cartels. These guys know what they're doing. So how can we help? Well, we had a huge success. Not us, but I think the civilized world had a good success earlier this year with these guys. They're called the Akasha brothers, the ones on either end, and some of their accomplices. They were arrested 2 years ago for shipping crystal meth to America. But we knew that they were implicated in a shipment of 30 tons of ivory that had been seized in Bangkok. And the DEA had just widened its scope. They'd said, we're not just interested in drugs anymore. If you've got wildlife crime, we can fold that in as well, and we can extradite these guys, and we can prosecute them in the States. They'd been languishing in a Kenyan jail, waiting for justice, but knowing they were pretty smug, knowing they were never going to face it because they were paying everyone off, and they thought they were going to get away with it. Well, 2 months ago, they were finally extradited to the US, and boy, did they squeal on that plane. So with these guys out, that's a huge dent in East African smuggling networks. These guys are proper kingpins. They never touch the ivory themselves. They're hard to catch, but with the kind of tools that are being used against the drug trade, they could be brought to justice. So the last and most difficult part is to persuade that huge population in China not to buy ivory. So we've been working with celebrities from China, bringing them over with groups like Wild Aid, to introduce them to the wonder of elephants and to show them the impact of poaching. And this is Yao Ming, who carried the flag for the Chinese team at the Beijing Olympics, 7'6" basketball player. And he's been a huge advocate, as have others like Li Bingbing, the Chinese actress, and even the Chinese state news agency who came out and helped break a dam wall, which was a sort of a de facto ban on reporting on ivory in China. And when they came out and met the elephants, they were like, no, we've got to talk about this. So these have all been successful. Back to the importance of of the global coalition and of America's role in facing outward. Starting with John Kerry, followed up by Hillary Clinton, and then taken right to the top by President Obama. The ivory issue has been on the table at the highest levels of bilateral meetings with China. And we know this has had an impact on turning China from being this huge problem to this decision at the end last year that they were going to close down their markets. And there were some naysayers saying, oh, well, we don't believe they'll do it. Well, on the 31st of December, they decided they would do it, and they did it twice as fast as anyone thought they would. So they've already closed all their factories, and by the end of this year, all their retail shops will be closed. We have a problem remaining, which is, this is another ivory burn done by Kenya, 8 times bigger than the 1989 one, done last year as another statement to try and push things further towards a ban. And this is my daughter standing in front of 11 pyres of burning ivory. So it's a huge success what's happened with China. Unfortunately, the road to the end of the ivory crisis doesn't end there, because we're seeing secondary markets now mushrooming up along the Chinese border in Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand. So we have to squat, but who's buying the ivory in those places? It's still mainland Chinese. So although we're going to work on enforcement in those countries, the demand is still critical. We've still got to do a better job of reaching through Chinese society and showing them what's going on. So here's a 60-second film that's showing in cinemas across Tier 1 and Tier 2 cities in China. I don't know if we... And this is Li Bingbing, who's a very famous actress. Thank you. This kind of work is essential, and it is working, but it's taking time. In all, with China, I think we see there's real light at the end of the tunnel with the whole of the ivory crisis. I don't think the recipe is fairly simple. I think we're going to get there. I think we're going to win, but we're not there yet. So we need to keep pushing. As we work to finish the ivory crisis, we're becoming increasingly aware of another secret challenge that has been arising, and the competition between elephants and humans over living space. And it's not just elephants, it's all of the natural world. And this is the great challenge that we face. At the moment, some recent modeling shows that 29% of the African elephant's current range is afflicted by human infrastructure or new farmland. And so you've got 29% of their range is already a conflict zone, disputed land between humans and elephants. By 2050, this is going to be north of 65%. So this is a big challenge, and it's much more difficult to counter than the ivory trade, where the prescription is really quite simple. With competition for space, people don't need ivory; they do need living space. And how do we take on this threat of human population growth? We can't. It's very difficult to take on. And in the 70s, there was a real push from the conservation movement to take on untrammeled population growth. But the wind has gone out of the sails of that movement now, and it's almost unacceptable to advocate for birth control. And it's also very difficult to stand in the way of the bulldozers creating a modern Africa. How can we refuse Africa the right to develop? We can't. We have to work alongside development. We have to find smart solutions to this growing overlap between humans and elephants. And that's where our tracking data comes in once again, because through the power of science, we can give elephants a voice through the technology that we put on their collars, and we can have them describe to us where they want to live and the connections that they need to keep with other elephants. So the collars that we've been deploying for security across Africa are actually going to serve double purpose by describing the landscape that they need to us. This is probably the biggest testing ground for this work now at the moment, which is in Tsavo National Park. The Kenyan government has put in a new high-speed rail link between Nairobi and Mombasa. Again, essential infrastructure. This is the link between East Africa and the Indian Ocean. They urgently need it, but the first designs had not a single underpass. And this railway line slices right through the middle of Kenya's largest elephant population and largest protected area. Thankfully, they saw sense. Eventually, they put 7 wildlife underpasses underneath the railway. There are a lot of issues remaining, but I think this is the kind of solution that we're going to have to see. One of the issues remaining is that road that you see alongside is a single lane road connecting East Africa to the Indian Ocean. That is next in line to be upgraded. So these underpasses underneath that railway are wonderful. They're working. We can see we're tracking 10 elephants down there at the moment. We're putting another 20 collars on in a month's time to see how elephants are using these underpasses. But what do we do about that road? That's where our tracking data is really going to be useful, because we need to get ahead of the planning process, and they need to factor in these underpasses from the very start. There's no way conservation is going to be able to afford the price tag of retrofitting underpasses. But if we can add 1 or 2% to the contract cost of building the road, then we might get it done. And this shows you I hope this is going to work. This is the issue. This is what's happening now with that road. That's one of the 12 remaining big tuskers in Tsavo, and that's the threat he faces most days, to get to water. And then finally, we have we have to try and find ways for humans and elephants to live, not on a sort of landscape planning basis, but how do we manage the interface between humans and elephants? Because elephants they're very big and very dangerous creatures. And humans are very aggressive when they feel they've been wronged. And if an elephant goes into your farmland and eats your year's crops, you're pissed. And you go out and you take revenge. And this elephant here is from Amboseli. He's called Tim. And he's also an enormous elephant, very, with enormous great ivory. And he's a celebrated, very famous elephant in Kenya, but he was getting into trouble because the swamp that he'd always gone to when times were dry and that he could find grass and water had been taken over by farmers. And suddenly he arrived there and he found that the swamp, which used to have grass in it, has now got tomatoes. And he was overjoyed. And it turns out Tim loves tomatoes. And he started helping himself and getting himself into a lot of trouble. And it was going to be a matter of time before he killed someone and was killed in revenge, or this was conflict. And so the Kenya Wildlife Service called us and said, look, we need to protect this elephant and we need to protect those farmers. Could you start tracking this guy? Initially we said, no, we don't want to track an elephant that big because with ivory that size, they can have trouble getting up. And we had to make a special collar for him, like at least 80 centimeters bigger than any we'd ever put on before. But it worked, and he leapt to his feet. Obviously, got lots of good nutrition from his tomatoes. And anyway, so we started tracking him. And Big Life, and actually you can see in this photo that this white spot on his back is a spear wound. So he was repeatedly getting speared already before we put the collar on, and that's Kilimanjaro in the background. So Big Life, who is a local organization in that area, devoted a vehicle to put on him. So we gave our tracking app to the rangers and a VHF antenna, so they get hourly reporting through the GPS, and they get a VHF bleep between those times. And their sole job, this vehicle, is to try and keep Tim out of farmland. Okay. So it's a game of cat and mouse across Amboseli. And we've got an intern there who's studying this. And here's a preliminary slide that he gave me on some of the recent interactions. And you can see the blue dots are his fixes, and these are his paths. And you can see him. This is farmland, and this is the park. So he's coming up here, and we lost some data here, but we had the vehicle found him there and sent him back, so repulsed him. He then moves back here and gets in there, and these dots here is the vehicle that's also being tracked. So they push him back here, and he's with 10 other elephants. Okay, and it turns out there are about 40 individuals that he does go crop raiding with, but he's got a core gang of 10. No, this is totally new. No one's ever studied exactly the composition of these crop raiding parties before. And it's fascinating. So you can see, and he's patrolling up and down. He's testing where they are. And you can see the vehicle coming here. They repulse him again here, and he gets in and makes another incursion there, and he's pushed out, and then finally he gives up and goes out. And we're having success pushing this guy out, but my God, is it labor intensive? My God, is he smart? And he'll get to a point and see the vehicle, and then he knows that the vehicle has to go around on the road. He'll just cross a little dry riverbed that the vehicle can't cross, and he knows he's got half an hour clear. And he can do a lot of damage in half an hour. The other solution that we've forged through science is to exploit the elephant's fear of bees. Now, one of our researchers noticed that the elephants had this, they didn't like pushing over trees that had beehives in them. So she started playing bee sounds to bees, and to elephants. And this is an elephant hearing bees, played from a speaker. Okay, so no actual bees, but the elephant was alarmed by the bees, and she would have run off again pretty soon after. And they all run when they hear bees, unless they hear them too often. If they hear them 3 or 4 times and there's no bees, they go, no bees. So they're smart. But you can use real bees. So what Lucy King did was started building beehive fences with wire strung between the beehives. And here's a farm that's successfully deployed a beehive fence. You can see what happens on one side and what happens on the other. So an elephant walks up, tries to get in, hits the wire, swings the beehives, bees come swarming out, and they run. We don't know exactly why they're scared of bees, but we know that they get stung in the eyes. And African bees are about the most potent of all bees. And you swell up, a person swells up a lot, and we think an elephant would too. And if they get stung on the trunk, then their trunk swells up. Elephants can't breathe through their mouths. They have to breathe through their trunk. So if their trunk swelled shut, that would be That would be curtains. So that may be why they run. Anyway, this technique, which we've just finished 3.5 years of trials, is 80% effective, keeping elephants out. 80% of all attempted incursions have been repulsed just by this technique. Even better, 100% of farmers who've put in beehive fences have their attitudes to elephants changed. So having been feeling totally powerless at these beasts that arrive in the middle of the night, completely silently and destroy a year's crops, they now have a tool, and they also have their income often doubled by selling this elephant-friendly honey, which you can sell at a premium. So it's been wildly popular. It's now being used in 14 different countries, including 3 in Asia. And we just published the technique on the website. The only constraint to its uptake is if there's no tradition of beekeeping. If people don't keep bees anyway, you can't persuade them. No. That's scary. But otherwise, very effective. So I guess just to close, these are the largest creatures we've got left that walk this planet. They're a parallel intelligence, close to our own. We share lots of features like emotion and compassion and empathy, and yet they've evolved separately from us. You can feel the spirit within when you're alongside elephants. They're the architects of their landscape. Those iconic African landscapes that we see wouldn't look the same without elephants. The Masai Mara would be thick bush, and the forests wouldn't have many of the seeds for the trees that we see today. A lot of those trees can only be spread by elephants. By protecting elephants, we can protect the ecosystems around them, the plants, the animals, the insects. The elephants are a flagship that can lead to the protection of these ecosystems. We can win against the ivory crisis, and I think we can win enough space in Africa for these elephants to survive. But just as with the ivory crisis, we need the world to come together to help. This can't be done by isolated organizations. This needs a global coalition. And I hope that all of you will join in some way and come and see elephants in Africa and stay engaged by coming to talks like this one. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you, Frank, for that incredibly sober but thoughtful overview. We're going to do questions. We have just over 10 minutes left, so we're going to have to do them sort of quickly. We have our online app, so if you have any that you want to ask on there, please go ahead. And while you're gathering your thoughts and your questions, I'm going to ask one from there because it relates to your last point on biodiversity. Are you coordinating with other institutions that are working with other animals that are under?
Yeah, so I've got actually my phone is in my bag, but I have the online, the tracking app that we have. We make available to other species as well, and although built for elephants, it also shows the lions from the Owasso Lions group that work in our ecosystem. The Grevi Zebra Trust show the zebra on there, and we have a bunch of oryx in Chad on the system as well. So that's just one example, but I think it's imperative that we all work together, both within the elephant community and without, because our problem with the space is the same.
The big driving point. Right, exactly. All right. Fidel Simmons, there's a microphone coming for the live stream audience. Thank you.
Just to follow that up, to what extent are the countries working together to coordinate saving the elephants?
To varying degrees. In East Africa, there are sort of two blocks. There's basically Southern Africa and the rest of the world. And the Southern Africans still believe that the route to saving these species, rhino as well, is to have a market for tusks and for horns, whereas the rest of us believe that might make it easier for them to secure their heavily fenced populations, but would lead to the very rapid wiping out of all wild populations across the continent. Yeah, they're aligned. I mean, they're aligned on all those things, and there's a new There's a new surge of interest in making management plans for elephants, and countries have come together under something called the Elephant Protection Initiative, and they are committing to plans that are harmonized between nations. So we're trying to forge those links to make countries work together as well.
Another question there, right here in back. Thank you.
Is that on? So one question, part A and part B. So part A is, it would probably be really upsetting to the elephants, but why don't people, I've heard, just cut off their tusks to make them unattractive for slaughter? And I know that would upset the elephants and probably affect their behavior. But part B is, if you couldn't do that, couldn't you put some sort of dye or something, maybe an invisible dye on the tusks that would make them unsellable? So.
Okay, I missed a crucial part of my talk, and I apologize. Although we've had a grave wave of killing, and we've had the trends were unsustainable. The predictions that elephants are going to go extinct in 10 years are false. There are more elephants than that. There are about 415,000 elephants left in Africa, estimated. The cost of us putting a collar on, it costs about $10,000 to track an elephant for 3 years. And a big part of that cost is the operation to anesthetize the elephant and put him on the ground in order to fit the collar. You would need to do that with every single one of those elephants you're gonna detusk. The other element of it is that the elephant's tusk is a modified incisor. And it's a live tooth that has a nerve that goes a third of the way down the tusk itself. And so you can only chop about half of the tusk off, and there's still like a section remaining coming out of the lip. And there was a very famous bull called Mountain Bull that I think actually Ian spoke about last time when he was here, who had his tusks trimmed, not to make him unattractive to poachers, but because he was a very naughty boy and kept on knocking over fences to get into farmland. So they thought, okay, we'll trim his tusks so that he's not so good at breaking fences. Trimmed the tusks, and about 8 months later, he was walking in Mount Kenya, and he was killed by a very barbaric technique they used there, using sharpened car springs that they dropped from trees into his kidneys on his back. He was killed for his ivory despite having lost most of it to being cut. And the dyeing of ivory, it's a very difficult thing to accomplish. You can't just paint the outside of a tusk, it would be scraped off. I've spoken to vets about it. The only way you could accomplish it is you could turn them green from the inside out, but you'd have to inject the pregnant mother with tetracycline 3 times during her pregnancy. So they're just not scalable solutions. Yeah.
Another really interesting question came online regarding the next generation, the millennials, getting involved in activism and sharing information about this. Are you seeing a resurgence in that in the next generation coming up in here in the U.S. as well as in Asia and China?
Yes, absolutely, and it's a big drive to try and engage the young people of the world, and especially the young urban people of the world, because the more disconnected people become from the natural world, the less interest they're paying it, the more precarious our position comes. And we urgently need to use every tool we've got to try and keep the young people of today involved in nature and feeling that link, and reaching out from beyond their screens and onto the link. So we have a couple of different programs trying to do that, using celebrities and models here who have huge social media reaches, and using them as ambassadors to try and reach the masses. It's a work in progress.
Sure,
yeah.
Absolutely. All right, back to the room. We have time for one or two more.
Yeah.
Have you had any experience with people misusing your tracking data, and is it protected from hacking?
It is protected from hacking. We're working with Vulcan, the Paul Allen Foundation, and they're currently hosting all of our tracking systems, and we're fairly confident of that security. I don't think, I haven't heard of any instances of elephant tracking data being used for ill. It has happened with rhino. Rhino is 10 times more expensive. The poachers in Africa get $20,000 a kilo for rhino. that is a different level of threat. And you start with that kind of money at stake, you start having a very real possibility of your rangers becoming corrupted, or someone in a control room slipping a text message out to a friend when a rhino is close to a fence. And that has happened, and we have to remain very vigilant about that. But I think with the risk of people hacking into the network and following elephants, I think is mercifully to date not been a threat that's been real.
Good question. I think we're the last one right here. The microphone's coming right behind you.
Thank you. So, Frank, I have 3 children who would be so interested in this. What would you do for them? Like, how do you get them involved now when they're young?
How old are they?
Because my youngest son would like to be you when he grows up.
Oh.
So how do you do that?
I think you take them to spend as much time in the wild as you can, even if it's not the wild of Africa, in the wild of the wonderful parks of America, and just having them outdoors. I think that's the most important thing. And Africa is the holy grail of many people that love the outdoors because of the diversity of large mammals that remain there. So anyone that's obsessed with the outdoors is going to one day want to come to Africa. But the first thing to do is to get them obsessed with the outdoors.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Frank Pope.
Thank you.
We are adjourned.